So we're on. Okay. Welcome everybody. I'm David Blight, History Department, and I direct the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery and Abolition. We are co-sponsoring this with the History Department. We're thrilled to welcome Vincent to Yale today. A special welcome to all of you out on the Zoom world. I ran into someone on the way over here that said she was hurrying home to watch this, and I didn't ask why. Anyway, by the way, we apparently have far more on the Zoom world than we do here. It's a thrill to welcome Vince to Yale. Vince is old friends with many of us. Broad field of Atlantic history and slavery study. Vince Brown is a Charles Warren Professor of American History at Harvard, has been, I think, for nearly 10 years. He's also the founding director of the History Design Studio at Harvard, and more on that in just a second. This is his BA in the University of California at San Diego, his PhD at Duke. He teaches in the field of Atlantic slavery, early America, U.S. South, Diasporic, Caribbean history, and other fields, and has made a big difference in the world of digital studies and indeed in filmmaking. His two major books, the first was the book The Reaper's Garden, Death and Power in the World of Atlantic Slavery, a stunning book. Came out at a time when people were finally studying such a subject as death in both the slave trade and in the American Civil War and other subjects. That book won numerous book prizes. The most recent book that we'll hear about today in just a moment is Tacky's Revolt, the story of an Atlantic slave war, from Harvard Press. I think I'm counting about 8 book prizes that this book has garnered, and a finalist for 7 or 8 more. It also won Frederick book prize, which we administered at the Lehrman Center. He shared it with Marjolaine Carr. Both of those books were on Atlantic or Caribbean slave revolts. And we heard that they were already out doing a dog and pony together, so we just decided to give them both the prize. Well, gave both prizes. They're both really good books, but anyway, we were thrilled that Vince was our winner. And I must say, on the night we gave the prizes, which was done as a webinar, done on Zoom with hundreds of people, we had high school students running the Q&A. And Vince sat there until the last question. It was really quite brilliant. I said, my questions, they were tough. Why do you do this? It's much better than the questions you get in history. Anyway. No offense. I want to say a word about Vince's work in mapping and in digital productions and in filmmaking. He has produced a number of films or created a number of films. There's one on Melville Herskovitz, which has won all kinds of attention and awards, called Herskovitz at the Heart of Darkness, at the Heart of Blackness, excuse me. I just discovered by reading through this, Vincent, we've been in about 4 or 5 documentaries together. Of course, you're never there together when they do it. But
they can't make a documentary without you.
No.
It's your voice.
No.
They need you in there.
No, but he's been in the film on Death in the Civil War, the African American series that Henry Louis Gates hosted, numerous other, the film called Birth of a Movement, which was about the origins of Birth of a Nation, the infamous film, multi-part film on Reconstruction. Many of them done by the McGee Media Company, which is a great film company, but also some of them done by Vince's own media companies. And just maybe we can get him to talk a bit about that. We've had Vince here before for our Race and Slavery Working Group. He served both on our jury for the Frederick Book Prize and then won the Frederick Book Prize. So without further ado, Vince is going to talk about this in the book, Tacky's Revolt and the Atlantic Slave War. Vince, welcome.
Thank you, David. I very much appreciate that. I want to apologize to everybody at home, but the closed captioning is a little bit off there at times. I noticed that it said that I had started a vegan media company. There's not necessarily anything vegan about my media company. No, I wouldn't be wrong. I think that would be a good idea. But
Well, they are consumer big answer.
Right, yeah. Anyway, I very much appreciate that lovely introduction. Thank you so much. It's great to be here, especially in a room with so many people like David that I admire and have admired for a very long time. He mentioned the Reaper's Garden, and I always say that any history book that we might write is a story. It's an argument, and it's an archive as well on its own, and hopefully it inspires future work. And it's the case that the first book, Reaper's Garden, I wrote was inspired by a single paragraph in Stuart Schwartz's great book on sugar plantations and the formation of Brazilian society. That was an archive which inspired my next argument and story. And I also hope that the things that I write will inspire people in the future and their work. So great to be here. I feel like I have in some ways a kind of tradition here. And so I'm very happy and pleased to be here. I also want to thank Joanne Meyerowitz for the introduction and for being my host this day, and Dana Lee for organizing the trip, the visit for me, and everybody who's met me so far and who will meet me later on today. I very much appreciate your time, especially on such a nice day. I know it's a nice day, and some of you guys are here in the room when the sun is shining, and I always appreciate when people are willing to do that. I want to speak this afternoon about the way we imagine the geographic contours of history. By default, we still often think in terms of discrete geographical units: continents, oceans, nation states, regions. Europe, Africa, America, East, West, or Middle East. Our teaching and research continue to be organized that way, even though we know that history doesn't generally unfold like that. Instead, I'd like to suggest that the geography of our imagination might take the shape of social phenomena, particularly this afternoon in relation to the hemispheric course of an Atlantic slave war in the Caribbean. Few Americans are aware, unless they've read the 5th chapter of Professor Rugemer's recent book, that in 1776, Great Britain's most important American colony was on the verge of insurrection. Colonists perceived that the government in Britain was conspiring against the rights of imperial subjects. They feared a plot against the English liberties that they had long enjoyed. At their dinner tables, they heatedly discussed the merits of open sedition. Those disaffected with imperial governance dwelled on the topic of American rebellion. As these Jamaican colonists debated liberty, their slaves saw an opportunity. The island was, if I can get this to move, okay. I'm not sure why we're frozen here. Here we go. The island was at a critical juncture. Thanks, Dan. The island was at a critical juncture with the British entry into yet another imperial war. Colonists traded exaggerated accounts of a French and Spanish military buildup in the Caribbean and calculated that there were 30 slaves to every white person ready to join the attempts of any enemy in a general massacre, they said. On July 3rd, 1776, a regiment of troops left Hanover Parish for a rendezvous at Port Royal, scheduled to depart the island for North America by the end of the month. Throughout that parish, enslaved people gathered frequently in houses, grounds, and open fields to hold what were called very serious conversations, which stopped suddenly upon the approach of anyone they did not trust. They were strategizing. Now or never, they thought, was the time to make themselves masters of the country. The moment seemed ripe for a successful uprising, but this American Revolution was not to be. As so often happened with slave rebellions, the plot was betrayed and the conspiracy unraveled. When the British in Jamaica considered the gravity of their predicament in 1776, rather than looking ahead to the loss of the 13 colonies of the North American continent, they looked to the past, back to the slave insurrection of 1760, which had been the most dangerous threat to the British Empire in America to date. They reflected on the differences between the unrest of 1760 and 1776, mostly in terms of the nature of warfare with their own slaves. Then, in April 1760, an enslaved West African chief called Tacky, or Tacky, staged a massive uprising against brutal conditions on the island of Jamaica, then the most important of Great Britain's American colonies. Over the next 18 months, as their numbers grew into the thousands, the rebels thwarted an initial crackdown, conducting a skillful guerrilla campaign against the might of the British Empire. Shaken by the scale of the revolts, Britain's colonial forces eventually responded with overwhelming force, killing and brutally executing at least 500 Black men and women. Hundreds more were transported from the island for life. But the brutal British response could not contain the revolt's consequences, which included an amplification of anti-Black racism, the emergence of a movement to abolish the slave trade, and perhaps most surprisingly, a reorganization of the British Empire that provoked another rebellion on the North American continent. 1776 customarily marks a moment in the origins of the United States of America, of course, when the Declaration of Independence announced the separation of the 13 colonies from the mother country. When referring to the origins of the nation, though, the date obscures the broader context of the times. It deflects attention from the fact that Britain held 26 colonies in America, not just the 13 that broke away, and that by far the most profitable, militarily significant, and politically connected of them were those in the Caribbean. This chart compares private wealth in various regions of Great Britain's empire in 1774. It divides the territories into England and Wales, British America as a whole, and then the 13 North American colonies that became the United States, those in the British Caribbean, and then it divides the 13 colonies into 3 regions, Southern, Mid-Atlantic, and New England. As you can see, colonists on the continent held nearly 70% of the wealth in British America, largely because the total population of property holders was much greater than in the Caribbean. But when you break North America down by region, you see that wealth increased as you move south. That is, according to the degree the colonial economy depended upon enslaved labor. And when you examine the average amount of property held per free white person, an astonishing disparity leaps out. In the British Caribbean, where some 90% of the population was made up of enslaved Black people, free white people were stupendously rich, boasting more than 17 times the wealth of those in the 13 colonies. Indeed, the average private wealth of a free white colonist in Jamaica, the single most lucrative American colony, was nearly 58 times greater than that of a similar settler in New England. Military deployments were distributed to protect that wealth, and Jamaica's planters and merchants wielded greater influence in the imperial metropolis than their North American peers. This might go some way to explaining why poor Governor Thomas Hutchinson of Massachusetts couldn't get as much support as he needed from British policymakers when rebels rose up in that marginal colony in the 1770s. Before that American Revolution, the British were well aware that the event we know as Tacky's Revolt represented a peak of imperial crisis, and slave revolt was generally a source of overwhelming concern. According to 2 slaveholders who wrote histories of the Jamaican conflict in 1760, one of them being Edward Long, pictured here, the rebellion was organized and executed principally by Coromantis from the Gold Coast, the West African region stretching between the Como and Volta rivers, who had an established reputation for military prowess. Their displacement, forced migration, and rebellion shows how the slave trade shaped what I call the diasporic warfare that convulsed the 18th century Atlantic world. Let me explain that now. The transatlantic slave trade spread people from Atlantic Africa throughout the Americas. Some who had been leaders or soldiers suddenly found themselves uprooted from sustaining landscapes, scattered by currents and trade winds, and replanted in unfamiliar territories where they labored to rebuild their social lives. Inevitably, Some of them determined that only war could end their bondage. Now, this process of dispersal from the native land, transplantation, and adaptation to a new and strange one is familiar to students of cultural change, who have examined transformations in African religion, expression, and identity by viewing African, American, and Atlantic history in a common frame. A similar approach shows how the turmoil of enslavement and the daily hostilities of life in plantation society generated a militant response that traveled, took root, and sprouted in rebellions that reverberated across the Americas and back to Europe. This is what happened when those called Coromantis broke out in a series of revolts and conspiracies in the 17th and 18th centuries, most dramatically in Cartagena, Suriname, St. John, New York, Antigua, and Jamaica, an archipelago of insurrections stretching throughout the North Atlantic Americas. The Jamaican insurrections of 1760 through to 1761, followed by further uprisings in 1765 and 66, were among the largest and most consequential of these. From what observers could glean of the aims and tactics of the rebels, it was clear that many had been soldiers in Africa. And perhaps whole cadres of people arrived in the Americas with military training and discipline, or at least some knowledge of defensive and evasive tactics learned in Africa. Indeed, as some scholars such as John Thornton suggest, American slave revolts might be seen in key respects as extensions of African wars. Viewing slave revolt as a species of warfare is thus the first step to envisioning a map of Atlantic slavery that shows how political and military practices travel, take root, and grow in disparate environments. Even as the slave trade forced people to remake and renegotiate their affiliations, the massive dispersal of Africans across the Atlantic scattered the seeds of military conflict throughout the Americas. The story of the Coromanti shows how African warfare was reconstituted, not as a direct continuation of previous struggles, but as an outgrowth of immigrant experiences. British slaveholders valued Coromantis highly. Planters stereotyped them as best suited for agricultural labor, and they had reputations for military bearing and discipline. They were often employed in command and supervisory roles in plantation work gangs, and sometimes played subservient roles in the armed forces, including the Royal Navy. But the British also said that Coromantis were particularly rebellious and prone to uprisings. They were dangerous to enslavers in part for the same reason that slave traders found the Gold Coast to be an abundant source of potential workers. In the 17th and 18th centuries, the region witnessed the transformation of major empires, Dinshira, Akwamu, Akyem, and Ashanti, among dozens of smaller polities which vied with each other in the region. The battles that attended these contests produced great quantities of war captives for sale to the Europeans on the coast. And they also produced a turbulent environment in which complex military campaigns involved both European and African rivalries, multiple alliances, negotiations, and treachery. In fact, people from the Gold Coast did not form anything like a single ethnic group in Africa. So who were the Coromantis then? According to the best research on the subject, they were people who spoke mutually intelligible languages, worshiped similar deities, and recognized common cultural symbols, forming what contemporaries call a nation in the Americas. As a basis of social communion, in an environment where militarism was a common experience, national gatherings could also provide a forum for people to plan, organize, and stage revolts. And when they did so, they drew upon their previous military experiences. However, I should say, as a category of belonging, Coromanti was cross-cut by many other axes of identification. Coromanti spoke more than one language and came from many different regions and kingdoms, from which they brought a variety of historical experiences. Just as importantly, once in America, they served different roles in slave societies. No amount of cultural similarity could resolve all the difficult negotiations of multiple interests and experiences among them. Even among their compatriots, enslaved Africans made friends and foes through a politics of belonging that made the debate about what it meant to be Coromanti in Jamaica as urgent as the forging of the identity itself. In the face of continual assaults on their personal dignity, slaves distinguished themselves by their political commitments as much as by ascribed classifications. Among the Coromantis, different ideas of how to live in slave society, how to evade its worst abuses, and how to destroy it altogether, shaped their rebellions even as they recalled prior experiences in Africa. In the turbulent world of Atlantic warfare, nothing was more important than learning where and how to form loyal units, alliances, and coalitions in the face of superior power. The enslaved had won this wisdom through hard experience on the Gold Coast before coming to America, where they learned it anew and with different particulars in order to make war on their masters. The former slave and Royal Navy veteran Gustavus Vasa, better known as Olaudah Equiano, famously defined slavery itself as a perpetual state of war. This was not war in the conventional sense between distinct armies directed by the rulers of states. Rather, mastery was by nature a forceful assault, to be met with simmering violence ignited by resentment against the fraud, rapine, and cruelty of slaveholders. To the enslavers, Equiano asked, "Are you not hourly in dread of an insurrection?" And it was not a rhetorical question. Equiano had been in Jamaica in 1772, with the island still reeling from the uprisings of the previous decade. There he had seen how an entire world could be organized around violence and counterattack. He held this view in common with Black people in other times and places, where the enslaved often characterized their bondage as a permanent state of low-intensity war, talking regularly about how they might wage that war. And this description might be more familiar now than it would have been a generation ago. Military theorists have become increasingly interested in warfare between great powers and improvised militias. Conflict dispersed over wide areas with largely undefined battle lines and blurred distinctions between civilians and combatants. These current trends in the study of warfare recommend a re-examination of the martial geography of Atlantic slavery too. Warfare migrates. This has never been more apparent than in the era when the violence of imperial expansion and enslavement transformed Europe, Africa, and the Americas as they interacted across the Atlantic Ocean. European imperial conflicts extended the dominion of capitalist agriculture. African battles fed captives to transatlantic trade enslaved, as I mentioned. Masters and their human property struggled with one another continuously. These clashes amounted to what I call a borderless slave war. War to enslave, war to expand slavery, and war against slaves, precipitating wars waged by the enslaved against slaveholders. In this sense, Tacky's revolt was but one war within other wars, which had diverging and overlapping provocations, combat zones, political alliances, and enemy combatants. In effect, it combined four conflicts at once. It was an extension of wars on the African continent. It was a race war between Black slaves and white slaveholders. It was a struggle among Black people over the terms of their communal belonging for effective control of local territory and the establishment of their own political legacies. And it was, most immediately, one of the hardest fought battles of the 7 Years' War, the titanic global conflict between Great Britain and its European rivals. Each of these four struggles emerged from different currents that converged and eddied in the Jamaican insurrections of the 1760s. Charting their course suggests new stories of place, territory, and movement, a new cartography of slave revolt that braids together the histories of Europe, Africa, and America. As an example, one of the revolt's principal leaders was a man called Wager, also known by his African name, Apongo. But before taking his part in the Great Jamaican Insurrection of 1760, Apongo had been a military official in West Africa during a period of imperial expansion and intensive warfare. He had once been a notable guest of John Cope, governor of Cape Coast Castle, Britain's principal fort on the Gold Coast. Captured and sold as a slave, Apongo became the property of Captain Arthur Forrest of the British Royal Navy. Renamed Wager, Apongo came in chains to Forrest's maize meal plantation in the parish of Westmoreland, where he again encountered John Cope, who had retired to his own plantation in the same parish. Occasionally, Cope would entertain his acquaintance from the old world, even laying out a tablecloth for Sunday visits. treating the slave as a man of honor and insinuating that Opongo would one day be redeemed and sent home. Now, whatever understanding there was between the two men did not outlast John Cope's death in 1756. And sometime over the next several years, Wager began plotting, organizing, and awaiting an opportune moment to launch his war against the whites. That's better, right? I always put that Thomas Disselwood up there just to troll people. Suffer like I had to suffer. Scholars of slavery are familiar with slave rebels who reacted against the conditions of enslavement by striking violently against their masters. And historians of Africa have examined the predicament of captives of elite status who fell into the hands of slavers and were subjected to the indignities of plantation life in the Americas. However, scholars have yet to give sustained attention to the complex patterns of alliance and antagonism over time and across vast distances that define relationships like that between Opongo, John Cope, and Arthur Forrest. Intertwined life histories like theirs remain poorly understood. Stories of displacement, belonging, and political predicament that link the transatlantic slave trade to diasporic warfare. John Cope spent a tumultuous few years in West Africa, taking the opportunity of internecine African strife to enhance the fortunes of the British slave trade. During his time there, the British shipped more than 35,000 men, women, and children from the region into slavery, allowing Cope to acquire his opulent life in Jamaica. Wager's enigmatic life story encompasses an unlikely odyssey from the administrative councils of West African statecraft and trade to a Royal Navy warship on active duty, to work as a sugar plantation driver, into leadership of a massive slave uprising, and finally to his summary execution on the public gibbet. Arthur Forrest, the naval officer and sugar planter, fought commendably in the 7 Years' War, even while his slaves staged the empire's greatest servile rebellion of the 18th century. These men were all traveling the main arteries of Atlantic Empire, but their divergent paths suggest alternative ways of mapping the Atlantic world, beyond those official plans and diagrams. As they engaged in these successive conflicts, these wars within wars, they connected the small-scale, everyday violence of enslavement and coerced labor to the grand scale of imperial geopolitics. Now, how exactly John Cope met Opongo remains a mystery, but speculating on the plausible scenarios in which they could have met teaches us something important about the circumstances of African ships from the Gold Coast to Jamaica in the same period. For most of the slaves and free Black people who would fight in the era's slave wars, struggles to create openings and possibilities across a landscape engulfed by violence were continuous features of their lives, whether they were leaders or followers in formal militaries or simply civilians swept up in the fighting. Now, the only explicitly biographical information about Opongo is found in that diary of the Jamaican overseer Thomas Disselwood. And in it, he wrote that prior to arriving in Jamaica 6 or 7 years before the insurrection, Opongo had been a prince in Guinea, tributary to the king of Dorne, who had conquered all the country for miles around him. So Opongo might then have been a war chief of Dahomey, the powerful slaving kingdom well east of Cape Coast Castle. Or perhaps he was from Adone, a smaller polity near the fort at Cominda, described as a powerful kind of republic in a map of 1729. He also might have been a subject of Ashanti, the expansionist state that would come to dominate the region by the end of the century. Or he could have been a headman from among Ashanti's Fanti enemies on the coast. These were backgrounds for other future slave rebels too. Among the probable circumstances for Opongo's encounter with Cope in West Africa, none of them conform wholly with what Disselwood recorded in his diary, but all of them underscore how likely it would have been for an African in Jamaica to know what Opongo knew, and to be able to draw upon that knowledge in struggles against colonial slavery. So Opongo's origins remain obscure. Disselwood's brief profile instead points to something more illuminating than the biography of an individual. It offers an unexpected opportunity to imagine the variety of Opongo's plausible pathways to the Caribbean. If any number of these situations could have brought Opongo to Jamaica, Any number of other Africans might have arrived in circumstances that made them similarly familiar with the martial geography of Atlantic slavery. So uncertainty requires us to draw a larger picture of Opongo's possible worlds, which would have given him and some unknown number of others an aptitude for political and military leadership and made them dangerous people to own. As always, we know much more about the owner than about the enslaved. Having put to sea at an early age, Arthur Forrest was recruited in 1739 to join an expedition to Portobello as pilot. He was confirmed to the rank of lieutenant in the Royal Navy the next year. Though the expedition against the Spanish was a notorious disaster, Forrest acquitted himself well during the amphibious assault on Cartagena in 1741 and launched a distinguished naval career, commanding 3 different vessels before being promoted to the rank of post captain on the HMS Wager on March 9, 1745. Opongo was renamed Wager after this significant milestone in Forrest's career. Between April 13, 1746 and July 3, 1747, a James Wager sailed with Forrest in the ship of the same name, which Forrest commanded from 44 to 48. Working the ship and watching the comings and goings in a naval port at war, Wager surely reflected on British power. It's impossible to know how impressed he was, but it's likely that he paid close attention to the rituals of hierarchy, stern discipline, and the eager aggression that made the Royal Navy such a capable force. The largest engagement of Wager's time sailing with Forrest occurred several months after he mustered aboard. In company with 2 other warships on June 6, 1747, HMS Wager chased 2 French warships between the Saint-Domingue coast and the small island of Tortuga to the fort overlooking the bay at Port Pay. Arranging into a line of battle, the English ran by the bay, firing upon the ships and forts, but came too close to the shore and had to bear away before they could get within cannon range. The brisk return fire from the French did little damage, but the forts above the bay had made the difference. Something Wager must have remembered when he gathered with fellow African rebels in the mountains above the Westmoreland Plains several years later. And having seen British sailors repelled, he surely knew that British power had limits. James Wager was discharged as unserviceable before the vessel made its return voyage to the United Kingdom via North America. He was probably released as part of a general practice of employing black sailors, often enslaved, in Caribbean waters and leaving them behind when the ships returned to England. So with Forrest away from Jamaica from 1748 through 1755, it's likely that Wager next encountered the captain upon his return to the island in 1756. Wager did not muster aboard Forrest's next command, the HMS Augusta, a 60-gun warship in which Forrest would have one of his most invigorating tours of duty, becoming one of the most celebrated naval officers in the Royal Navy after the Battle of Cap Francois in 1757. John Cope, Wager's potential patron, died in 1756, and with him Wager's hope of manumission. Through 1758 and 59, while Wager labored on a sugar plantation, contemplating his dwindling prospects for freedom, Forrest became the hero of the Jamaica Squadron and the toast of the British Empire. Soon afterward, Wager, at once Forrest's mascot, his former crew member, and one of the principal men on his Jamaican estate, led a rebellion that would destroy Forrest's fortune. So you can get a glimpse, I'm sorry that you're far away and the resolution may not be quite good enough, but you can get a rough glimpse of the way the entire revolt unfolded on these maps here, which are in the book. In the time that remains, what I want to do is sketch out what I think are some of the event's underappreciated reverberations to give you a sense of why I think the insurrection was so consequential, and how I hope my work can model the kinds of connections that braid events in distant locales across long spans of time. Tacky's revolt anticipated the American Revolution by a decade and a half, and the Haitian Revolution by 3 decades. It can thus be considered one of the first great events of what historians call the Age of Revolution. And yet it's hardly known outside Jamaica to people who aren't historians of the British Empire or Atlantic slavery. This is despite the fact that it influenced 2 of the signal moments of the era: the reorganization of British imperial governance that so irritated colonists in North America, and the early beginning of the movement to abolish the transatlantic slave trade. So let me talk about each of those in turn. In the aftermath of the revolt, to recoup some of the public costs, Jamaica's House of Assembly passed new poll taxes and commercial duties. The colonial government also committed to a tax on vellum, parchment, and paper ascertained by stamps, something that imperial reformers would attempt a few years later for all of America. The Jamaica Stamp Act of 1760 was meant explicitly to address the cost of the revolt. The duty continued in force until December 1763, when it was repealed as too great a burden for all of the wealthiest colonists. As a model for the more contentious 1765 Stamp Act that would rile the colonists in North America, the 1760 tax was an early local instance of a far larger reform effort stimulated by the 7 Years' War. As imperial policymakers celebrated military victories in North America, Africa, and the Caribbean, they contemplated the threat to their most vital colony, which raised the urgent question of how an expanding empire might contain its internal antagonists. In this liminal moment for imperial management, a new policy would take shape. Now, British statesmen had worried over the governance of America for more than a decade, since the conclusion of the previous war with France and Spain in 1748. The colony's demographic, economic, and strategic value had increased dramatically in the first half of the 18th century, and the complexity of administering them had grown in tandem. British members of parliament were spurred into a reform effort partly by the behavior of North American colonists during the 7 Years' War. In the midst of the conflict, colonial assemblies flouted the authority of governors. Elected officials allowed flagrant violations of the Navigation Acts against trading with the enemy, and colonists often failed to supply enough local troops and resources to the war effort, all while breaking and violating the alliances with indigenous Americans that the British had made. As the historian Jack P. Green has explained, this coincided with a dramatic shift from an essentially permissive to a fundamentally restrictive philosophy of colonial governance in London, amplifying the widespread conviction that the colonies had too many privileges and that those privileges ought to be reduced. News of the slave war in Britain's most profitable colonies strengthened the policymakers' resolve. In this, they were helped by a shift in attitude among colonists in Jamaica. Now, Jamaican colonists had previously been as rested and independent as their North American counterparts, but the slave insurrection reminded slaveholders of the benefits of empire. They soon conveyed their gratitude, along with a request for more troops to the new king, George III, and the Lords of Trade. The Colonial Assembly thanked the king. If not for his majesty's forces, they wrote, quote, the lives and properties of their loyal subjects would in all likelihood have become a prey to their slaves. Like North American colonists, slaveholders in Jamaica resented the influence of metropolitan intervention, as well as the imposition of new taxes. However, unlike so many in North America, their recent experience with slave revolt encouraged them to remain duly subject to imperial command, even passing that Stamp Act to help finance their own security. They did not like many imperial reforms, but they acquiesced to them. After the 7 Years' War, with Jamaica having served as a model for the assertion of imperial control, policymakers preferred a raft of new legislation for their North American colonies. Yet, unlike colonial Jamaica's submission, these policies inspired the well-known backlash that would ultimately split the British Empire in 1776. If the Jamaican insurrections helped to shape imperial policy toward the colonies, they also offered a rationale for the reform of colonial slavery. Fearing further rebellion, concerned Britons put forth pragmatic plans for enhancing the security of colonies by limiting their dependence on the slave trade and ameliorating the condition of the enslaved. Ironically, perhaps perversely, the work of the historian planter Edward Long had a significant impact on a budding anti-slavery discourse. Long argued that slave revolt was a criminal trait of the Coromanti people, and his fearful hatred of Coromantis fed his loathing for Africans in general. Indeed, through a chain of association linking various unwelcome traits, blackness itself came to signify the general potential for danger that Long attributed most specifically to Coromantis. In the end, regardless of their differences, Long surmised that Black people must actually constitute a different species of humankind. For this view, Long has been called an early proponent of scientific racism, which gained currency in the 18th century as writers sought to classify and rank the world's peoples. More immediately, though, Long's racism was as much a specific reaction to Black political agency as it was a general theory of human difference. His views projected his experience of the fragility of white mastery in the West Indies, where slaveholders had recently been frustrated, at times even humiliated in their attempts to pacify the enslaved. Though he thought that slavery was unavoidably necessary in his terms for the increase of English commerce, he viewed the African presence as an unqualified evil. In arguing that the principal threat to colonial slavery were African, and especially Coromanti insurgents, Long promoted the idea that a native-born population would be more tractable. He thought that if planters could avoid working their slaves to death, as they often did, attach them to estates rather than continuing to scatter them by sale, establish better conditions for child rearing, and encourage the progress of Christianity, then slaveholders might be more secure in their possessions. They could also save money on the ever-rising prices of imported laborers from Africa. Raising up native-born populations would facilitate what reformers constantly referred to as the improvement of the plantations and would lead to a kinder and gentler and less menacing slavery. Through the beginning of the 19th century, people who campaigned against the slave trade would invoke Long's text to argue that ending the traffic would enhance the internal security of the British Empire. In this way, Jamaica's turbulence indirectly helped to nurture the emerging anti-slave trade movement. Now, fear of Africans had indeed inspired the first efforts to restrict the transatlantic trade. Responding to a 1712 uprising, African uprising in nearby New York, the Pennsylvania Assembly imposed a prohibitive 20-pound duty on slave importations, citing diverse plots and insurrections not only in the islands but on the mainland of America as the reason for their action. After a revolt near South Carolina's Stono River in 1739, that colony enacted a 10-year moratorium on the importation of Africans, but planters soon found they could not do without them. Amid news of Jamaica's troubles in the 1760s, other colonies tried again. Virginia's legislators attempted to levy increased duties on imported slaves in 1767, 1769, and 1772. As Virginia's governor explained to British officials, colonists had just cause to apprehend the most dangerous consequence of importing Africans and should find means, he said, not only of preventing their increase, but also of lessening their number. He believed that the interests of the country would manifestly require the total expulsion of them. Now, influenced more by merchant interest than by colonial concerns, London disavowed all three of these Virginia Duty Acts. Restrictions on the slave trade were more successful in Pennsylvania. In 1761, with news of Jamaica's slave war appearing regularly in the Pennsylvania Gazette, the colony passed a law to increase the import duties on slaves and extend its enforcement in perpetuity. In 1773, Pennsylvania doubled the impost, and finally, in 1780, the colony passed an act for the gradual abolition of slavery. As much as these laws might have expressed increasing opposition to the practice of slaveholding, and they did, there were also security measures aimed at discouraging the arrival of potentially insurgent Africans. If most whites feared the presence of Africans, many others empathized with their plight. In the abolition movement's early beginnings, African rebels often drew sympathetic responses, especially from people in places that held fewer numbers of slaves than in the Caribbean. As accounts of the executions traveled, many British and North American readers were more horrified by the brutality of their British co-nationals than by the violence of the rebels. One pamphlet that circulated during the 1760 revolt, J. Fillmore's Two Dialogues on the Man Trade, argued that given the terrors of enslavement, nature's higher law authorized violence against enslavers. I'm quoting at length. All the black men now on our plantations who are by unjust force deprived of their liberty and held in slavery, as they have none upon earth to appeal to, may lawfully repel that force with force, and to recover their liberty, destroy their oppressors. And not only so, but it is the duty of others, white as well as black, to assist those miserable creatures if they can in their attempts to deliver themselves out of slavery and to rescue them out of the hands of their cruel tyrants. A few others are willing to go this far, at least in print. But the pamphlet influenced Anthony Benezet, the Pennsylvania Quaker, who laid the intellectual foundations for slave trade abolition in the British Empire. Although he avoided the topic of slave revolts, he frequently invoked higher law doctrine against the trade of human beings. Among his fellow Quakers, a fervent opposition to war induced them to see the violence stimulated by slave trading as an unconscionable evil. And their belief that the slave trade was a constant source of war was an orthodox line of reasoning through the early 19th century. Even some who could not condone slavery could condemn slaveholder tyranny. In 1764, a Boston writer asserted that West Indian planters were used to an arbitrary and cruel government over slaves, having for so long tasted the sweets of oppressing their fellow creatures. That sentiment reverberated strongly in James Otis's Rights of the British Colonies Asserted and Proved, published the same year. His defense of the rights of American settlers from the intimidation of imperial administration declared that colonists are by the law of nature freeborn, as indeed all men are, white as well as black. In England, in the early years of the American Revolution, the literary celebrity Samuel Johnson famously raised a toast to the next slave rebellion in the West Indies at an Oxford dinner party. So by the end of the century, stories of revolts against slaveholders and the gruesome executions of slave rebels had helped to promote an emerging anti-slavery consciousness, which ultimately enabled the campaigns that turned the British public against the slave trade and slavery in the 19th century. But this all happened too late for the rebels themselves. Like most slave insurrections, Tacky's war ended badly. The insurgents were killed or captured, publicly executed in grisly displays, or banished from the island, probably along with many bystanders who had taken no part in the fighting. The Coromantis would not win the colony from the British, as the North Americans would do 2.5 decades later, and as the Haitians would do by 1804, taking Saint-Domingue from the French. But the rebels in Jamaica did not know they would fail. They acted with the hope of success. Even amid the business of war and enslavement in a colony garrisoned for battle with foreign and domestic enemies, they could find fissures in the landscape of planter power beyond the reach of the slaveholders' whips. They could even challenge the combined forces of the British Empire and find an enduring place in popular memory. Yet the legacy of the 1760s is ambiguous. At the close of the 7 Years' War, Britain kept its prized colony. Though Tacky's revolt did help to stimulate an imperial reform effort that provoked a greater challenge on the North American continent. If the Jamaican revolt in some ways anticipated the Haitian Revolution, even offering a beacon of hope to the enslaved, they also left Black people divided. The Coromantis augmented their reputation as formidable fighters, helping to cast doubt on the wisdom of continuing the transatlantic slave trade, while at the same time strengthening the association between Blackness and social danger. Even in the United States, as late as the mid-19th century, anxious slaveholders would refer to potential troublemakers as Tackies among us. Perhaps the ambiguous nature of these legacies helps to explain why they register so faintly in the imagination today beyond Jamaica. The Coromanti wars that shaped the era don't fit neatly into the prevailing narrative of the rise and progress of liberal freedom, even though such small, dirty wars epitomize the relationship between labor, commerce, and global power. That they seem out of place in our prevailing narratives is also due, I think, to the reluctance to acknowledge slave revolt as an act of war. By custom, we treat war as an interruption in the normal course of affairs. War is an anomaly in the regular order, a disturbance, a break, an aberration. We commonly assume that lines of battle between warring states constitute the most important theaters of military engagement, and that peace treaties can mark a war's definitive end before another one begins with new causes and different fronts. By contrast, when war becomes a way of life, as in the abundant violence of slave war, there is no border and no final result. The state of war that enabled Atlantic empires to flourish, the violence of state-making, territorial acquisition, and strategic competition, flowed into the quotidian brutality that typified the social relations of slavery, where the projection of will and the exercise of power were at their most naked and absolute. This skittering aggression joined faraway lands to the most intimate spaces. Places do not have locations, but histories, argues the anthropologist Timothy Ingold. Bound together by the itineraries of their inhabitants, places exist not in space, but as nodes in a matrix of movement. Diasporic warfare highlighted what historian Lauren Benton has described as the tangled and interrupted spaces. They reflected complicated lines of political contention across the transatlantic theater of events. Through these militarized enclaves of association and corridors of control, traveled people whose aspirations, struggles, and practical adaptations created shared regions of experience and emergent knowledge, shaped by the intersection of personal and collective trajectories through the world of war and trade. These show how African history is American history and Black history is world history. The uprisings of the 1760s in Jamaica charted this connection through a landscape of force and its limitations that the maps of the powerful never meant to depict. These countermappings reveal a geography of hope and possibility in the making. Fugitive territories carved out through political struggle that were difficult to maintain and are, in most cases, yet to be won. Thank you.
Vince is happy to manage his own questions.
So I think we have plenty of time for connection.
We do. First.
I haven't been in a room this full in like 2 years. So maybe I can manage my own.
Bob Marley.
We're about to find out.
Question?
Hi. So you mentioned a new geography of slavery. You also mentioned a new cartography of slavery. They're different.
Sure.
So I'm wondering if you could tell us a bit about your collaboration with Molly Roy.
With
Molly Roy,
yeah,
the cartographer
she's
for the
great.
maps. And what were there times when you felt like the kind of typical mappings of slavery were inadequate to the story you were trying to tell? What did that back and forth look like? How did you end up feeling happy about the kind of the way you're trying to narrate this cartographically in the book?
Fantastic question, thank you. So they are different. I feel like cartography is one of the ways we map the geographic imagination. So what I'm talking about here is not just geography itself, right? But the way we think about geography, the way we think about different things of length and how they're connected to each other. And cartography is a tool for representing that, right? So I'm glad you asked about my collaboration with Molly Roy, because it was a really fun experience. Because what I told her early on is that I wanted to keep a cartographer on retainer as I was finishing this book. I sent her the chapters, and I said, I would like to design some maps that would tell this story without people having to read the book. Like if you just picked up these maps and read these story maps, would you have a handle on the Revolt and the way it played out? And she was fantastic at meeting that task, which was telling the story in a series of these graphic panels so that, you can't really read these in the way they are because the resolution is too low here. So that if you kind of just had this as a book of maps, I think you have a sense of the way the Revolt played out. And that helped us understand something important that I didn't think emerged from the textual printed sources that I have, which is a sense of strategy and tactics and intentions on the part of the rebels that were not conveyed by the way the slaveholders described the revolt. They had to be conveyed by locating all of these various movements in space and then interpreting what the likely logical connections between those movements were. So actually, as I said at the end of the talk, thinking about the trajectories that people used to move through space helped me think about their strategies, tactics, and intentions, both on the part of the enslaved and also on the part of the counterinsurgents. It was a fantastic collaboration. I don't know if you wanted to follow up on that, but I very much appreciated that work.
I was thinking also just about just the way, like the maps of the Gold Coast, West Africa, where the maps you showed historical have lots of boundaries of kingdoms. Your maps don't have that. Those kinds of things. Just sort of, some of those things, the kind of the basic features of maps that I noticed are a little different. I assume that's intentional.
So long conversations and negotiations about this. So the historical maps we had used would have boundaries, but of course, those boundaries are ever shifting and they weren't territorial boundaries in the same way. Most of these polities claimed people, right? As much as more than they did territory. So kind of having a shifting line wouldn't really tell you much about like how the polity worked. So we took away all those lines. What else did we do that was here? But they still had kind of locations, and they still had areas of population that were important to represent, especially when trying to figure out what the kind of trajectory of people moving through space meant about what their movements were and what they were trying to do. We also talked about representing the topography, which was important. A lot of political maps don't represent topography, but as we were looking at, as I was writing about the revolt, where people were in elevation was crucial to how they were fighting and crucial to the kinds of strategies and tactics they had to employ. So I did want to make sure that topography, in some respect, was represented on this because, if you were from mountainous regions, you probably had better ability, more skills at navigating a mountainous place like Jamaica than you would have if you were from along the coast. So those kinds of things, thinking about geography, thinking about topography, thinking about how we represent that through cartography became crucial to writing the story.
Thank you.
Is it William?
Yeah.
We met at Brown, right?
Sure.
Yeah, sorry. We have masks on.
I know, I'm only half a person, that's right.
Good to see you.
He's the map man.
Yeah, no, I know. I've been on a panel with him.
Thank you so much for this talk. Really exciting stuff. And as I was listening to your talk, sorry, I'm the resident historian of Ghana here, so I'm going to be a little specific.
I'll leave that up there.
But as I'm listening to your talk, the thing that I found interesting is that the two West African figures that you offer us, Apongo and Tacky, are potentially not Coromanti. By the, even by Edward Long's definition, he seems to be suggesting Akan speakers when he says Fanti, Achem, Ashanti, and all other races. Tachi is potentially Ga, and I'm willing to bet that Apongo is from Dorma in the Bono region, right? So he might not even be he's an Akan speaker, but he's not a Fanti speaker, perhaps. So I'm interested in how you are sort of parsing this history as an ethnic history, and one that emerges in the sort of Atlantic world. In a way, you're telling a story much like the story of how we tell the story of the origin of the Yoruba.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. Except that Coromanti didn't really return to Ghana. So
I mean, you don't have the kind of English professors in Brazil part of that where the Yoruba are made into a kind of category of analysis by scholars, right? Kind of thinking about this larger history. But what you do have is a process of ethnic formation, kind of ethnogenesis. And that's my entry into this, which is, whether or not, yes, and as you say, Tachi is a kind of a Ga name for a chieftain from the eastern Gold Coast. Yeah. So he's kind of unlikely to be from this area that we're focused on here with Apongo. And yet, clearly, like people from this region are struggling together. And so they have made common cause, partly based on the things that they share, whether it be usually intelligible languages, even if not the same language, recognizably familiar deities, recognizable symbols of political authority, like the stool. These help them to recognize each other vis-a-vis, and this is the crucial part, all these other Africans who are kind of, come from this great swamp between the Senegal and the Zaire rivers as far around to Southeast Africa and Madagascar, right? So more in common with each other than with these other people that were classed together. And that's the way I'm thinking about this. Under pressure, right? In this large and diverse environment, lots of people may become Coromanti who are not from the same region, who certainly might have been enemies and certainly from different polities outside of Jamaica. So thinking about that process is more important to me than identifying, absolutely where each of these people came from. Not that can't help, but what I'm trying to suggest to readers is that we have to understand the, the kind of the crucible environment of the world of war and trade as helping to make peoples in the Atlantic world in a place like Jamaica. Does that make sense? You want to follow up?
For sure. No, I take that to be completely correct. And I think I would hand that, I think I would give that to you with the figure of Apongo. in part because he's an Akan speaker from shared sort of neutral world. But the name Tacky is only because Ga and Akan languages aren't mutually intelligible, which is why I'm wondering if we know a bit about how he is able to declare himself Tachi, field marshal, general, and lead a potentially group of more likely Akan speakers. That itself seems.
So I think that the question is crucial, which again kind of speaks to, the fact that it's just not just an ethnic rebellion. So, Monica Schuler, in older literature, Monica Schuler and Eugene Genovese and others would say like, oh, this is an African ethnic group, right? And they come somehow intact to Jamaica. Well, your question, and I think what the book shows is that that's not the place to start. The place to start is with the question of how they actually come together, right? Now, even if Ga and Akan languages are mutually intelligible, there's been all of this interchange along the coast and so much, not only kind of war, but political exchange and trade, that people speak more than one language. So it's not inconceivable at all that Tachi would have spoken an Akan language as well as Ga by the time he gets to Jamaica. And I think that's kind of well laid out in Walter Rucker's book, Gold Coast Diasporic, where he talks about that kind of, he calls it Akanization. I don't know how you feel about that, but the important thing again there is that there's a process of historical transformation on the Gold Coast that these people are caught up in that predates their arrival in Jamaica. And the larger point here, and I don't think we would disagree about this, is that that history within West Africa, not just African culture, right, in some kind of regional sense, but history of actual transformations, certainly from the mid-17th century through the 18th century, is playing out in the Americas as well, right, through the experiences of these people. And so if you could fill in some of those details, if some things that I couldn't find out about these individuals, I think that's great. I think we actually share some methodological assumptions, which to me are more important in terms of the way I think about what this book has to teach. Please.
This was fascinating and really wonderful. So happy that you're here with us. I had a question about a sort of different set of methodological assumptions, which it seems that part of the claims that you're making here is that this history ought to be seen in a context of kind of military history, of military strategy in a way that it may or may not be in an obvious way. So I just wonder if in writing this, either in the kind of process of thinking about your actors as military strategists or tacticians, thinking about the traditions they're coming out of, or in the reception of the book, if it has led you to any set of thoughts about the state of military history as a field, how much you've been in conversation with it, how much your work has been sort of embraced by that field, how much you see yourself in that conversation.
Yeah, it's great. I kind of conceived this book as a raid on military history, in part because I was using a lot of the conventional sources of military history. The Admiralty sources, the Royal Navy were very important to the work that I did. But I was asking questions that military historians really hadn't asked about this event or events of its kind, right? So obviously, and I think I picked up a little bit on this talk, this has been seen as a slave revolt and therefore part of the history of slavery, maybe part of African-American history. The major account of the 7 Years' War, the kind of exhaustive account by Fred Anderson, which runs to like 600 pages or so, doesn't mention Tacky's revolt at all. This despite the fact that many of the soldiers, sailors, and Marines who suppressed Tacky's revolt had been in more famous campaigns like in the Battle of Quebec, or in the conquest of Senegal, or fighting in Martinique and Guadeloupe. And with the musters on the ships, you could trace them, right? Directly from Guadeloupe to Jamaica. In fact, the Wolf's third in command at Quebec is in command of the Jamaica station during the suppression of this revolt. For them, it's clearly part of the same war, yet for historians, and certainly military historians, it's something else. That's kind of an interesting question of why, right? Why isn't this a military history already? Why would this be a raid on military history? And I think we kind of know the answer, right? A slave revolt is part of another history. And therefore, despite what happened, despite where you can place things in place and time, where the people were, it doesn't count, right? And so that's one of the things I'm trying to do, is kind of insert this into the military history of the 18th century and see what people do with it, right? See if they feel like they have to account for it. It's one of the reasons, and I was telling this to Ed this morning, that I was pretty methodologically conservative in the way I wrote the book, kind of using well-documented sources, trying to locate and pinpoint people in place and time as they move along to a degree of detail that I think military historians would have to account for. Now, the second part of your question, how it's been received, I don't know yet. I mean, we're 2 years in. I haven't heard from a lot of military historians, except for, interestingly enough, a Jeremy Black, who's a kind of very conservative military historian who wrote me a very nice note about the book. I don't know if I should feel good about that or if I should worry about that.
What's the research?
Yeah. But again, the sources for military history were fantastic, and they allowed me to do some things that military historians are not doing with those really great sources.
Hey Vince, if we were to look at, so say, the wealth of scholarship on the end of slavery in the British Empire, 1833 content, how much have the whole series of slave revolts been part of that? Because your argument is that this is part of the legacy of so much to come.
Yeah.
But in the histories of the end of slavery in the empire, now there's a lot there, I know, but how much of Tacky's revolt or any 6 others been part of that? That this history of warfare is so replete in the empire that finally, you gotta get rid of it.
It's a great question, and how we connect up some of these earlier slave revolts with the later revolts that we know about is kind of crucial. I mean, you look at Ed's work on the emancipations, right? So if we kind of talk about, the Haitian Revolution as an emancipation, and British emancipation, and then the Civil War, and then the emancipations of the Iberian colonies, slave revolt is fundamentally a part of all of those emancipations. I mean, we can know much more about that. But I think that we have been dealing with this tenacious idea that these revolts, like Tacky's revolt staged by Africans, are somehow pre-modern. And those of you who kind of engage in the historiography of slavery will know there's a kind of little book, but a very influential book by Eugene Genovese called From Rebellion to Revolution, in which he kind of used Tacky's revolt as a hinge between these pre-modern, restorationist, backward-looking rebellions and the forward-looking rebellions, right, that begin with kind of the American and the Haitian Revolution, right? That becomes a pivot between pre-modernity and modernity. Now, the problem is that assumes, right, that Africa is this pre-modern place, right? That things haven't changed there, that people from Africa are, don't have a history or are not engaged in the same history that the Caribbean and the Atlantic world is in, right? The assumption there is that Africa doesn't have a history that needs to be accounted for in the Americas, right? And that's the assumption that I think this book questions. Because if you look at, someone like Opongo, who is not only involved in various state-making campaigns in West Africa, he serves aboard a British Royal Navy warship at war with the Spanish and the French. And then he's a sugar plantation driver. And then he's an African rebel. Is he restorationist? Right? What we need to know about him is that he's trying to restore some African, pre-modern African world that he already knew. He's fundamentally part of everything that's going on. But we have this kind of tenacious idea that Africans are not part of everything else that's going on. And that, I think, is the idea that I'm trying to question here. So, back to your original question, which is, yes, Tacky's revolt also, as I'm trying to document here with the American Revolution and with these initial kind of campaigns against the transatlantic slave trade, is part of that movement. Never mind the fact that this is staged and organized principally by Africans, it's still part of that larger movement that we would undeniably call modern in the Atlantic world. And then, of course, culminating in these emancipations that, that we get to in the 19th century.
Any other questions? Your chance, last chance.
Please.
Well, can I just ask a question really outside of the context, I guess, of the talk and the book, which was about the digital history, because David had mentioned that you've invested a lot in projects having to do with digital history. And I'd like to hear kind of what you think is the value of these and what they're serving and what they're doing, because I think it often gets tossed out. And look, this is great. This person is, on the cutting edge doing digital history.
But why?
Right.
But why? But
So,
who cares?
so I'm curious to hear what functions it's serving and how it enables you to tell stories or reconstruct the past in some different way than, say, the academic monograph or anything else.
So I love that question a lot, and I guess it goes back to my answer to William, which is that what I'm trying to do. Look, we understand things through our conventions, right? Our conventions through representation, and so what we can understand of something is often contingent on how we represent that. There are things that if we represent them visually, we can see, we can understand differently, and maybe sometimes better than what we can learn from print, okay? And so in this particular case, as I said, the print sources didn't really tell me a lot about the intentions and strategies of the rebels themselves. But seeing them kind of move through space, seeing those trajectories helped me to understand something of that, right? So then cartography just became a medium which allowed me to understand something that the print sources didn't allow me to understand as well. So to kind of come back to your question more generally, I am always looking for a medium that might help me see something, help me understand something, hear something, feel something that another medium might not help me as well with, right? And so that's where I think the real advantage, not only of digital history, but of multimedia history more generally is how does the representation of a thing help you understand it differently than you might if you only understood it through another medium? And I'm always looking for what the properties of that medium are that can help me. So like there are things that are better understood when they're seen, and there are things that are I think better understood when they're read. And so I have a long essay. I made an animated map of this revolt that I put online several years ago, and I have an essay on it as a representation. And a long part of that is here are all the things we don't know from this map. We can't see the terror, alarm. We can't see the kind of internal feelings that people write in their diaries, et cetera. What we see in imagining how people move through space on the map doesn't tell us the whole story. That's a book. There's a book for that now, right? But I learned something from making that map. I learned something from viewing these maps and working with Molly Roy that was just really hard to see when I just read the textual sources. And I do the same thing with filmmaking, which is I try to make films about the visual, where seeing things on a screen suggests something that reading might not. So David mentioned the Herskovits film. So for those of you who don't know, the anthropologist Melville Herskovits was one of the crucial people to establishing the study of African diaspora culture in US universities, especially with a book called Myth of the Negro Past in 1941. But what a lot of people don't know is that part of his method was, when he began working in the late 1920s, people assumed that the slave trade and slavery had denuded Black people of any ancestral heritage they might have from Africa, right? And so he spent his career trying to document formal cultural connections between Africans and what would be called African Americans, okay? But as part of that effort, he would shoot film in different parts of West Africa, and then in the Caribbean and in South America, and collected stuff from the Southern United States. And then he would juxtapose these cultural practices that shot in one place with cultural practices shot in another place, and imagine a cultural history of connection between them. So cinema was his analytical method. And so when I began to do some research on him, I thought well, why not make a film that actually represents the way he thought, the way he conceived these ideas, better than I might be able to do that in print. So I'm always looking for ways to think, what does the medium uniquely afford that another medium might not? And the digital does a lot of things. And William can tell you, someone who just hired me, Alex Gill, who's a digital humanist that I work with a lot. These are the kinds of things we talk about. So what? Why do we need this technology as opposed to some other technology? What interpretively does it offer us that we need? Right, so it's not just like, surplus capital needs an outlet. There's a lot of money in Silicon Valley, and there's a whiz-bang effect, right? And there's a certain kind of prestige associated with high production values. Yeah, I know that's happening. I'm not gonna lie. That's happening. But the real question is like, what does this technology afford? What does the medium allow us to think about that we would have a harder time thinking about it?
Not to mention audience.
Yeah, but I mean, for us as analysts, right?
Yeah.
Kind of what we want is to be able to tell a story, to answer a question that would be harder to answer otherwise, right? And yes, the prestige attracts an audience. I think that's right. I just saw, have you guys seen that new movie, Everything, Everywhere, All at Once? The new Michelle Yeoh movie? It's pretty interesting. I saw it with my 14-year-old the other day. And what struck me is that it's a movie that's managed to incorporate the TikTok aesthetic in cinema, right? With kind of lots of rapid fire changes of a character in the course of the same scene. It's very familiar to her. And so the kind of like rhetorical conventions of TikTok are now helping to sell cinema to a younger generation that's got another medium. That's probably what we're doing when you talk about audience. It's like, how can I take what I already want to do with my analysis, historical interpretation, and storytelling, and make it intelligible to viewers, readers, who don't share the old conventions but have new ones.
Well, I have two 14-year-olds, so I guess.
So you know what I'm talking about, right? You know exactly what I'm talking about. That's a wild movie.
Vince, thanks. Thanks so much.
Thank you all.